heat in the Arizona territory did not just sit on the land. It possessed it. It was a heavy, physical weight that pressed down on the crown of Eli Thompson's hat and seeped through the worn leather of his vest. The air tasted of alkali dust and dried sage, a flavor that had been in his mouth for so many years he hardly noticed it anymore. Eli rode his dust-caked bay gelding through the bottom of a dry canyon trail, the animal's hooves clacking rhythmically against loose shale and baked earth. It was late afternoon, and the sun was dipping toward the jagged western horizon, painting the sandstone cliffs in violent shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. He was miles from anywhere that could be called civilization, drifting toward the border town of Sanos Creek with the vague intention of picking up work or perhaps selling off the small head of cattle he had moved for a rancher up near Prescott. But for now, he was alone, a man comfortable with his own silence, accompanied only by the dry rasp of cicadas and the creak of his saddle leather. He was 35 years old, though the sun and the wind had carved lines into his face that suggested a man who had lived half a century. His eyes were the color of faded denim, watchful and usually calm. But today there was a tension in his shoulders that he could not quite shake. The territory was on edge. The treaties were failing. The mines were encroaching deeper into Apache land, and the military was spread too thin to police the hatred that festered between the settlers and the native tribes. The canyon narrowed, the walls rising steep and high, cutting off the breeze. Ahead, where the trail curved around a massive outcropping of red rock, the dry riverbed widened slightly, offering a grove of twisted cottonwood trees that usually signaled water deep beneath the sand. That was when he heard the shouting. It was not the casual banter of drovers pushing a herd, nor the sound of men greeting travelers. It was a jagged, angry sound, thick with adrenaline and cruelty. Eli pulled back on the reins, bringing the bay to a halt. He tilted his head, listening. The voices were harsh, overlapping one another. "Hang her high, string her up before the patrol comes." Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He nudged the horse forward, moving slower now, his hand drifting instinctively to the Winchester rifle scabbarded against his saddle. He did not want trouble. He had spent a lifetime stepping around other men's violence, doing his best to keep his own hands clean after the war. But the desperation in the voices pulled at him, a magnetic force of impending tragedy. He rounded the bend and the scene laid itself out before him like a tableau from hell. A group of 6 men, their clothes dusty and their faces flushed with whiskey and rage, had gathered beneath the largest of the cottonwoods. They were town roughs, the kind of men who found courage in numbers and righteousness in a bottle. Their horses were ground-tied nearby, stamping nervously. In the center of the circle, a horse had been positioned beneath a thick, sturdy branch. Sitting on the horse, her hands bound behind her back with rawhide, was a young woman. She was Apache, even from this distance. Eli could see the terrified whites of her eyes against the dirt and blood on her face. She wore a torn buckskin dress, and her dark hair hung wild and matted around her shoulders. A noose, fashioned from a stiff hemp lariat, was already around her neck. The other end was thrown over the branch, held taut by a burly man in a checkered shirt who was grinning as if he were about to win a prize at a county fair. Eli stopped his horse 40 yards out. The sand muffled his approach, and for a moment, none of them saw him. He watched the scene with a detachment that frightened him. He calculated the distance, the windage, the angle. "Spying witch!" one of the men shouted, slapping the flank of the horse the girl sat upon. The horse skittered, and the girl gasped, struggling to keep her balance. If the horse bolted, her neck would snap instantly. "She's been signaling the raiders," another yelled, waving a half-empty bottle. "I saw the smoke." She said nothing. She did not beg. She did not scream. She merely stared out at the horizon with a look of devastating resignation, as if she had already accepted that this was how her world would end. Eli did not make a conscious decision. There was no moral debate in his mind, no weighing of consequences. There was only the sudden, overwhelming certainty that he would not watch this happen. He slid the Winchester from its scabbard, the metal warm against his palm. He levered around into the chamber, the mechanical click-clack sharp and loud in the stillness. The sound turned heads. The man holding the rope looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" he barked. "Let her go," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the dry wash with unmistakable clarity. The burly man laughed, though it was a nervous sound. "This here is tribal business. Stranger, she is a thief and a spy." "Right on, I said let her go." The man's face hardened. He gave a sharp tug on the rope, tightening the noose against the girl's throat. She choked, her head snapping back. "You interfere, and you can swing right beside her. Cowboy." The man nearest to Eli, a thin fellow with a long duster coat, reached for the pistol at his hip. It was a foolish move. Born of arrogance and slow reflexes, Eli did not hesitate. He raised the rifle to his shoulder and fired in a single fluid motion. The crack of the rifle shot shattered the canyon silence. He did not aim for the man. He aimed for the rope. The bullet severed the hemp line just inches above the girl's head. The tension broke instantly. The rope went slack, and the sudden release of pressure caused the horse beneath her to rear violently in panic. The girl was thrown from the saddle, hitting the ground hard, rolling into the dust. Chaos erupted. The thin man in the duster screamed and cleared his holster, firing a wild shot that whizzed past Eli's ear like an angry hornet. Eli worked the lever of the Winchester, his movements automatic, drilled into him by years of survival. He fired again. The thin man crumpled, clutching his chest, the dust around him puffing up red. The burly man who had held the rope roared and pulled a shotgun from his saddle boot. Eli saw the dark twin bores swinging toward him. He spurred the bay, leaning low over the horse's neck as he fired a third time. The heavy lead slug caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. The remaining 4 men scrambled. Their bravado evaporated the moment the reality of death entered the air. Their horses, spooked by the gunfire and the smell of blood, danced and kicked. 2 of the men managed to mount up and wheel around, firing blindly over their shoulders as they spurred their mounts toward the canyon exit. The other 2 scrambled for cover behind the rocks. Eli did not pursue them. He rode straight for the girl. She was lying in the dirt, coughing, her hands still bound behind her back. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock, unable to comprehend that the man who had just killed 2 of her tormentors was a white man. Eli swung down from the saddle before the bay had fully stopped. He kept the rifle tucked under his arm, his eyes scanning the rocks where the survivors had hidden. "Get up," he said, his voice rough. She did not move. She stared at the body of the man in the duster, then at Eli. "We have to move," he urged, grabbing her by the upper arm. He hauled her to her feet. She was light, terrifyingly so, as if she were made of hollow bird bones. "Up, now!" He pulled a knife from his belt and slashed the rawhide bindings on her wrists. Her skin was raw and bleeding where the leather had dug in. She rubbed her wrists, looking at him with a mixture of terror and confusion. "Why?" she rasped, the word barely audible. "Get on the horse," Eli commanded, ignoring the question. He boosted her into the saddle of his bay gelding. She grabbed the horn, her knuckles white. Eli swung up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to steady her, the other hand still gripping the rifle. He could feel her trembling against him, a vibration that went straight through his chest. He spurred the horse, turning away from the town, away from the trail, and driving them hard toward the broken, rocky spine of the mountains to the north. Behind them, the canyon held the bodies of the dead, and the silence began to creep back in, heavy and accusing. They rode for hours, pushing the horse harder than Eli would have liked, but fear was a cruel master. The sun finally bled out of the sky, leaving behind a twilight of indigo and gray. The heat broke, replaced by the sudden, biting chill of the high desert night. Eli guided them up a narrow goat path that wound into the higher elevation of the Dragoon Range. He knew this country well enough to navigate by the silhouette of the peaks against the stars. He was looking for a specific place, a shallow limestone cave hidden behind a screen of mesquite and scrub oak that he had used years ago during a storm. When they finally reached the shelf of rock, the moon was rising, casting long, skeletal shadows across the canyon floor below. The horse was blown, its sides heaving, coated in a lather of sweat. Eli slid off first, his legs stiff, and reached up to help the girl down. She all but collapsed into his arms. Her legs gave out the moment they touched the ground. Eli caught her, surprised again by her lack of weight. She was exhausted, likely dehydrated, and suffering from the shock of near death. He carried her into the cave. It was dry and smelled of old dust and animal droppings, but it was sheltered from the wind and hidden from the valley floor. He set her down gently on the sandy floor and went back to tend to the horse. He loosened the cinch, stripped the saddle, and rubbed the animal down with a handful of dry grass, whispering soft apologies for the hard ride. He poured the last of the water from his canteen into his hat for the horse, watching it drink greedily. Only when the animal was settled did Eli turn his attention back to the human life he had saved. He gathered a small pile of dry driftwood and dead sagebrush near the mouth of the cave, striking a lucifer match against a rock to spark a small fire. He kept it low, just enough for warmth and light, shielding the flame with a circle of stones so it wouldn't be seen from below. The flickering orange light revealed the girl more clearly now. She sat with her back against the cave wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was young, perhaps 18 or 20. Her face was bruised, her lips split and swollen. Dirt was ground into her skin, but beneath the grime, her features were striking: high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes that were vast and dark, holding a depth of intelligence that unsettled him. Eli took his second canteen, the one he kept in his saddlebags for emergencies, and uncorked it. He approached her slowly, crouching down so he wouldn't loom over her. "Drink," he said, extending the canteen. She flinched as he moved, pressing herself harder against the stone. Her eyes darted to the pistol on his hip, then back to his face. "I am not going to hurt you," Eli said, softening his tone. "You need water." She hesitated, then reached out with a trembling hand. She took the canteen and drank, at first tentatively, then in desperate gulps. Water spilled down her chin, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her neck. "Slow down," Eli warned gently. "You will make yourself sick." She lowered the canteen, gasping for air, and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She handed the vessel back to him, her gaze never leaving his. "Thank you," she whispered. Her English was heavily accented, the vowels flattened and strange, but understandable. Eli nodded, taking a sip himself. "What is your name?" She watched him for a long moment, assessing him. He could see the gears turning behind her eyes. She was deciding how much truth to offer him. "Ayana," she said finally. "Ayana," Eli repeated. It sounded like a sigh of the wind through the canyon. "I am Eli." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of dried beef jerky and a tin of peaches. He cracked the tin open with his knife and offered it to her. She ate with the same desperation she had shown the water, using her fingers to scoop the fruit into her mouth. While she ate, Eli sat back on his heels, studying her. The adrenaline of the shooting had faded, leaving behind a cold, heavy residue of guilt. He had killed 2 men today. He told himself they were bad men who were about to murder a helpless woman. But Eli knew that the soul did not distinguish between righteous killing and murder. The weight was the same. "Why were they hanging you?" Eli asked. "They said you were a spy." Ayana paused, a slice of peach halfway to her mouth. She lowered her hand slowly. "They hate," she said simply. "They say I steal. They say I watch their wagons for the others." "Were you?" She shook her head fiercely. "No, I was walking, alone. I look for herbs, medicine. They find me. They drink the fire water. They say I am spy." She looked down at her hands. "I am alone. I have no tribe here." Eli watched her face. It was a good lie. or perhaps a partial truth. Her eyes were too sharp, her demeanor too composed for a simple gatherer of herbs. But he said nothing. In this land, everyone had secrets, and he had just shot 2 men to buy her the time to keep hers. "I cannot go back there," Eli said, gesturing vaguely toward the south. "There will be a posse. The sheriff in Sanos Creek is a hard man, and he won't care that they were in the wrong. He will only care that a drifter shot 2 citizens to save an Apache." Ayanna looked up at him. "You saved me. Why?" Eli picked up a stick and poked at the fire, watching the sparks rise and vanish into the darkness of the cave roof. "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose I didn't like the odds." He looked at her again, and his eyes caught on something resting against her collarbone. In the scuffle, her dress had shifted, revealing a necklace made of braided leather and silver. It was not the cheap trade silver often seen in the towns. It was old, hammered dark and dull. Carved into the center of the silver disc were 3 distinct symbols: a jagged line of lightning, a coyote track, and a circle broken in half. Eli froze. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Where did you get that?" he asked, pointing to the necklace. Ayanna's hand flew to her throat, covering the silver. "It is mine, from my mother." Eli stared at it, his mind racing back 10 years, to a campfire in the Gila wilderness. He had been riding with an old scout named Jebediah Quiet, a man who had lived among the Chiricahua for a winter. Jeb had drawn those same symbols in the dirt with a stick. The mark of the ghost walker. Jeb had said, "The one who walks between the living and the dead." It is a legend. Eli. A test sent by the spirits to see if the world is worth saving. It was a superstition, a campfire story. And yet, seeing it here, around the neck of a girl he had just pulled from a hanging tree, made the hair on his arms stand up. "It is old," Eli said. "Be careful who sees it." Ayanna studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You know the signs. I heard a story once," Eli said, dismissing it. "That's all." He stood up, needing to put distance between them, needing to check the horses, needing to look at something other than the haunting beauty of her face and the strange, heavy destiny that seemed to hang around her shoulders. "Get some sleep," he said roughly. "We ride at first light. We need to put 50 miles between us and that town before noon." He grabbed his blanket roll and tossed it to her. "Use this. It gets cold up here." "What about you?" she asked. "I'll keep watch." Eli moved to the mouth of the cave, settling himself against a boulder that offered a view of the trail below. He laid the Winchester across his lap and tipped his hat down low, though he knew he would not sleep. The night deepened. The moon climbed high, turning the desert into a landscape of silver and ink. Somewhere in the distance, a pack of coyotes began to yip and howl, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls. It was a sound of hunger, of the wild reclaiming the night. Eli listened to them, his hand resting on the cool metal of the rifle receiver. He thought of the men he had killed. He wondered if they had families. He wondered if their ghosts were already walking the trail behind him. He heard the soft scuff of a footstep behind him. He did not turn immediately. He waited until he felt her presence right beside him, the warmth of her body radiating in the cold air. Ayanna knelt beside him. She did not look at the trail. She looked at him. Her face was half in shadow, half in moonlight. The fear that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by an intensity that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. She reached out and clutched the sleeve of his shirt. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You are not sleeping," she said. "No." She moved closer, until her shoulder brushed against his arm. The scent of her, dust, sage, and something uniquely female, filled his head. "You know," she whispered. Her voice was different now, deeper, woven with the same strange cadence as the coyotes outside. "Know what?" Eli asked, his voice tight. She leaned in, her lips inches from his ear. "You were meant to find me." Eli turned to look at her, startled by the conviction in her tone. It wasn't gratitude. It sounded like a prophecy. "That's just talk." "Ayanna, I was just passing through." "No," she said, shaking her head slowly. "The spirits do not make mistakes. You stopped the rope. You broke the circle." She stared at him, and in the moonlight, her eyes seemed to swallow him whole. There was a pull there, a tension that was sudden and sharp. It was the tension of survival, yes, but beneath it was something else, a spark of attraction that felt dangerous and inevitable. Eli felt a flush of heat travel up his neck. He was a solitary man, a man who had denied himself softness for years, and having her this close, bound to him by violence and rescue, was intoxicating. He pulled away slightly, unsettled. "Go to sleep, Ayanna," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something in his face. Then, she released his sleeve. She nodded once, satisfied with whatever she had found. She retreated to the back of the cave, wrapping herself in his blanket. Eli watched her go. He watched her curl up on the hard stone floor, her breathing evening out within minutes. He sat alone in the dark, the gun heavy on his lap. The coyotes howled again, closer this time. Eli Thompson looked out at the empty, brutal land he called home, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. He had saved a life today, but as he watched the rise and fall of the Apache girl's chest, he had the sinking feeling that he was the one who was truly in danger. The dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains not with a gentle warming, but with a sudden, violent clarity. The sun crested the eastern ridges like a raw wound, spilling blood-red light across the gray stone of the cave entrance. The temperature jumped 10 degrees in the span of 20 minutes, promising a day of punishing heat. Eli Thompson was already awake, crouched by a small, smokeless fire of dry twigs, boiling coffee in a battered tin cup. He watched the sunrise with narrowed eyes, his mind mapping the terrain ahead. The horse, a sturdy bay he simply called Red, was rested but thirsty. They needed water, and they needed distance. Ayanna stirred in the corner, throwing off the wool blanket. She sat up quickly, her body tense, before memory caught up with instinct. She looked at Eli, her dark eyes clearing of sleep. "We move today," Eli said, handing her a piece of hardtack biscuit. "Eat. We have a long ride." "Where?" she asked, taking the biscuit but not eating it yet. "West," Eli said, pointing toward the violet horizon where the desert flattened out, toward the California line. "There is a mission near San Xavier, then open territory. The law does not reach far into the deep desert. You will be safe there." Ayanna shook her head. It was a small movement, but absolute. "No." Eli paused, the tin cup halfway to his mouth. "No, north," she said. Her voice was raspy from the dust, but firm. "We go north, toward the Mogollon Rim." Eli frowned. "That is Apache country, and it is crawling with cavalry patrols right now. General Crook has scouts in every canyon. Riding north is suicide for me, and likely for you if we run into the wrong patrol." "It is my home," she said. "My people are there. Your people might kill me before I get within hailing distance." Eli countered. "And if the soldiers find us, they will hang me for a murderer and send you to a reservation prison. West is the only chance." Ayanna stood up. She was small, barely coming to his shoulder, but in the morning light, she cast a long shadow. She walked to the edge of the cave and pointed a slender finger toward the northern peaks, which were jagged teeth against the pale sky. "If we go west, I die," she said. "My spirit dies. I am not a mission Indian. I will not weave baskets for priests. If you want to save me, truly save me, you take me home." Eli looked at her. He saw the set of her jaw, the fierce pride that had survived a lynching mob. He knew he could force her. He could tie her to the saddle and ride west, telling himself it was for her own good. But looking at her now, standing against the vast backdrop of the territory, he knew that would be a different kind of killing. He sighed, a long exhale that carried the weight of a bad decision. "North," he muttered. "We will drown in dust and dodge every soldier in the territory. But fine. We go north." They set out within the hour. The land they traversed was a testament to the hostility of creation. It was a landscape stripped of mercy, composed of dry canyons that wound like scars through the earth, vast forests of cholla and saguaro cactus that stood like silent sentinels, and gulches where the shadows hid rattlesnakes coiling in the cool dirt. The heat was a physical blow. By mid-morning, the sun was a white hammer pounding against the earth. The air shimmered, distorting the distance, making the mountains look like they were floating on pools of mercury. They rode double on red, with Ayanna sitting behind the saddle, her arms wrapped tentatively around Eli's waist. The heat radiating from their bodies made the contact uncomfortable, sticky with sweat. Yet Eli found himself hyper-aware of her presence. She was light, moving with the rhythm of the horse, her breath hitching whenever the bay stumbled on loose shell. They spoke little during the high sun. Energy was too precious to waste on words. Eli kept his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the ridge lines for the glint of metal or the dust cloud of a rider. He stuck to the low ground, navigating dry creek beds where the brush offered some cover, though it slowed their progress to a crawl. Around noon, the horse began to flag. Eli pulled up in the shadow of a massive limestone overhang. "We rest here," he said. "The horse needs a break." They slid down, their legs stiff. Eli uncorked the canteen, rationing the water carefully. 2 swallows for her, 1 for him. The rest poured into his hat for Red. Ayanna sat against the rock, wiping sweat from her forehead. Her face was still swollen from the violence of the day before, but the swelling had gone down enough to reveal the delicate architecture of her features. She watched Eli check the horse's hooves. "You know this land well," she observed. "I have ridden it for 10 years, Eli said, dropping the horse's hoof. "I used to drive cattle through the basin. Before that, I prospected in the Bradshaws." "You are not like the others," she said. "The men in the town?" Eli snorted, dusting off his hands. "I killed 2 men yesterday. Some would say I'm exactly like them." "No," she said. "They kill for hate. You killed for balance." She took a deep breath, her eyes drifting to the shimmering horizon. "You asked me why they hunted me, why the sheriff wanted me dead." Eli sat down opposite her, rolling a cigarette with practiced, calloused fingers. "I figured it was just hate. It was a plan," she said quietly. "I was not caught stealing. I was taken. A traitor, a man with one eye. He caught me near the Salt River. He tied me and brought me to the town. He sold me to the sheriff for $50. Eli stopped rolling the cigarette. He looked up, his blue eyes hardening. "Sold you?" "The sheriff, a man named Miller. He did not want a prisoner. He wanted a hanging. He told his men that if they hung an Apache girl, my tribe, the Bedonkohe, would come down from the mountains in rage. We would burn the farms. We would kill the settlers." "Why would he want that?" Eli asked, though a dark part of him already knew the answer. "Because if we attack, the army comes," Ayanna explained. "If the army comes, they clear the land. They push my people to the reservation at San Carlos. And then the sheriff and his friends. They take the water rights. They take the gold in the hills. I was bait, Eli. I was meat to catch a wolf." Eli struck a match on his boot heel and lit the cigarette, inhaling deeply to steady his nerves. The smoke tasted bitter. He knew men like Miller, men who viewed the territory not as a home, but as a ledger to be balanced in blood and gold. It sickened him, a deep, roiling nausea that had nothing to do with the heat. "That is a heavy thing to carry," Eli said softly, "knowing you were meant to start a war." Ayanna looked at her hands. "I prayed to the spirits that I would die quickly. If I died, my brothers would mourn, but they might not attack if no one saw it. But you stopped the rope. I seem to have a habit of interfering with bad plans," Eli muttered. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the heat. Eli looked at the girl, this pawn in a game of greed, and felt a crack in his own armor. He had spent years convincing himself that he was just a man passing through, that the wars of this land were not his concern. But here he was, sitting in the dirt with the catalyst of a potential massacre. "I am not innocent either." "Ayanna," he said suddenly. The confession clawed its way up his throat. She looked at him. "Waiting, 6 years ago. Eli said, staring at the burning tip of his cigarette. "I was riding scout for a cavalry unit near Camp Verde. We were tracking a raiding party that had hit a supply wagon. We cornered them in a box canyon." He paused, the memory vivid and jagged. It wasn't a raiding party. It was a hunting group. Old men, a few women, drying meat. The lieutenant gave the order to fire. I knew it was wrong. I saw the women, but I was young. I was scared, and I followed orders. He flicked the cigarette away. It landed in the dust, smoldering. I shot a man who was running for cover. He had a bow, but he wasn't aiming at me. He was trying to shield a child. I killed him. Eli refused to look at her. He waited for the condemnation, for the anger that he deserved. He waited for her to spit on him or tell him to leave her there to die. Instead, he heard the shifting of gravel. Ayanna moved closer. She did not touch him, but she entered his space, her presence a palpable warmth. "Does his face haunt you?" she asked. "Every night," Eli whispered. "Then you have paid a price," she said. She reached down and pulled the hem of her buckskin skirt up slightly, revealing her thigh. There, wrapping around the golden skin, was a thick, jagged ring of scar tissue. It was ugly, white and puckered, the mark of iron biting into flesh. "My sister and I were taken 3 winters ago," she said, "by men from the mines. They kept us in a shed, chained to the wall. They did things. My sister, she stopped eating. She stopped speaking. One night, she managed to slip her hand from the cuff. She grabbed a knife. She did not attack them. She cut her own throat." Eli looked at the scar, then at her face. Her eyes were dry, but they held an ocean of old pain. "I broke my thumb to get out of the cuffs," Ayanna said softly. "I ran until my feet bled. I survived, but I carry the mark. And I carry the memory of her blood on the floor." She let the skirt fall back down. "We are not so different. Eli," she said, "you carry ghosts. I carry ghosts. The land does not care. The land only asks if we can keep walking." Eli looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift in his chest. It was the breaking of a dam. The isolation he had wrapped around himself like a coat against the cold began to fray. He saw her not just as a victim, or a beauty, or a native, but as a mirror reflecting his own damaged soul. He nodded slowly. "We keep walking." By late afternoon, the terrain grew rougher. The flat desert gave way to rolling foothills covered in sharp scrub oak. Eli sensed that Ayanna was weary, her grip on his waist loosening as fatigue set in. He stopped the horse. "You need to know how to ride properly," he said. "If I get shot, you cannot be bouncing around like a sack of flour." He dismounted and showed her how to sit deep in the saddle, how to grip with her thighs rather than her knees. He showed her how to hold the reins, one hand light, the other guiding. "Like this," he said, placing his large, calloused hand over her small, brown one. "You don't pull, you ask. Red is a good horse. He listens to the weight of your body." She nodded, concentrating. Her brow furrowed. When she successfully turned the horse in a tight circle, a small, triumphant smile broke across her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it hit him with the force of a physical blow. It transformed her face from beautiful to breathtaking. Later, when they stopped to rest the horse again, he pulled the Winchester from the scabbard. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "I can shoot a bow," she said. "Rifles are louder," Eli said. "And they kick." He showed her how to shoulder the weapon, how to tuck the stock tight against the pocket of her shoulder so the recoil wouldn't bruise her. "Cheek to the wood," he instructed. "Close one eye. Look through the V of the sight. Put the bead on that cactus bloom." She struggled with the weight of the gun. It was heavy, the barrel dipping. Without thinking, Eli moved behind her. He wrapped his arms around her, his chest pressing against her back. He used his left hand to support the barrel, his right hand covering hers on the trigger guard. "Steady," he murmured, his voice rumbling against her ear. "Breathe out. Squeeze. Don't pull." The proximity was sudden and overwhelming. He could smell the dust in her hair, the salt on her skin. He could feel the heat of her back burning through his shirt. For a moment, the lesson was forgotten, replaced by a sharp, electric awareness of her body against his. Ayanna went still. She didn't fire. She leaned back slightly, just an inch, pressing closer to him. Eli froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. A traitorous rhythm. He slowly lowered his arms, stepping back, clearing his throat. That is the general idea," he said, his voice rough. "You practice." She lowered the rifle, turning to look at him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were dark and dilated. The sun began to set, painting the sky in riots of orange and magenta. They found a campsite near a cluster of boulders that blocked the wind. Luck was with them. Hidden in a cleft of the rocks was a natural spring, a small pool of clear water fed by an underground aquifer. The water was a miracle. After 2 days of dust and grit, the sight of it was like a hymn. "We wash," Eli said. He turned his back, walking to the far side of the rocks to give her privacy. He stripped off his shirt, using a rag to wipe the grime from his face and chest. The water was cold, shocking and revitalizing. He washed the dust from his hair, shivering as the cool air hit his wet skin. He heard a splash behind him. He froze, then turned, intending only to tell her to be careful of the depth. Ayanna had entered the pool. She was still wearing her buckskin dress, but it was soaked through, clinging to her form like a second skin. The water turned the leather dark, outlining the curve of her hips, the swell of her breasts. She had washed her face, and drops of water clung to her eyelashes like diamonds. She waded toward him. The water was up to her waist. She looked at him, her gaze dropping to his bare chest, to the myriad of small scars that mapped his life of violence. She reached out. Eli stopped breathing. Her hand was cool and wet. She placed her palm flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. She didn't speak. She just touched him, as if verifying that he was real, that he was flesh and blood and not just a savior spirit. The sensation of her wet palm on his hot skin was excruciatingly intimate. Eli felt a shudder run through him. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to pull her close, to taste the water on her lips, to bury himself in the sanctuary of her. But the ghost of the man he had killed in the canyon, the ghost of her sister, the reality of the hanging rope, it all rose up like a wall. He was a man of 35, with blood on his hands. She was a girl of 20, hunted and traumatized. He could not take advantage of her gratitude. He could not confuse survival with love. He stepped back, the water swirling around his thighs. He took her hand gently and removed it from his chest. "Ayanna, no," he said, his voice straining. She looked hurt, confusion clouding her eyes. I cannot," Eli stammered. "It is not right." He turned and waded out of the pool, grabbing his shirt and walking quickly back to the fire, cursing himself for a fool and a coward. Night fell completely. The desert was a bowl of stars. The Milky Way, a bright slash of milk, spilled across the black velvet above. The fire had burned down to coals, casting a low, red glow. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence thick between them. Eli cleaned his gun, the mechanical motion soothing him. Ayanna stared into the embers. Eventually, she moved. She crawled around the fire pit until she was sitting next to him. Eli did not move away this time. He couldn't. She reached out again. This time, her fingers traced the long, white scar that ran across his ribs, a souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene. "You have many marks," she whispered. "Maps of bad choices," Eli said, not looking up from the gun. She moved her hand up, resting it on his shoulder. Her touch was feather-light, yet it anchored him to the earth. "You saved me, Eli," she said. "I did what anyone would do." "No," she insisted. "You saved me." She leaned in, her face coming into the light. Her eyes were fierce, demanding he acknowledge the truth of what was happening between them. "I can save you too," she whispered. The words hung in the air. Eli looked at her. He saw the offer in her eyes, not a repayment of debt, but a gift of grace. She was offering him a way back from his guilt, a way to feel something other than the weight of the gun and the road. He set the rifle down. He turned his body toward her. "How?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer with words. She tilted her head, her lips parting slightly. Eli groaned, a low sound deep in his throat. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her damp hair. He pulled her close. The kiss was slow at first, hesitant. It was a question asked and answered in the language of breath and skin. Her lips were soft, tasting of water and smoke. Eli felt a trembling start in his hands and spread through his entire body. Ayanna made a small sound and pressed closer, her arms going around his neck. The kiss deepened, losing its hesitation. It became raw, hungry. It was the collision of two desperate people finding shelter in one another. Eli's hand slid down her back, pulling her flush against him. The heat of the day was nothing compared to the heat flaring between them now. For a moment, the world fell away. There was no sheriff, no hanging tree, no war. There was only her mouth, her skin, the desperate beat of her heart against his chest. Then, reality crashed back in. Eli pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the urge to pull her back down. "I don't want to take more from you," he whispered, his voice ragged. "You have lost so much. I am just a drifter. I will leave you empty." Ayanna pulled back slightly, just enough to look him in the eye. Her face was flushed, her lips swollen, but her gaze was steady and clear as the spring water. "You are the only thing I want to give," she said. Eli looked at her, stunned by the simplicity and the power of her words. He realized then that she was not the one being saved. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against the cold desert night. And for the first time in years, Eli Thompson did not feel alone. He looked up at the North Star, the guide to her home, and knew that he would walk through hell to get her there. But as the fire died down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the trap she had spoken of, the trap set by the sheriff, was nothing compared to the trap of loving a woman he could never truly keep. The transition from the low desert to the high country was not gradual. It was a brutal ascent up the spine of the Mogollon Rim, a geological violence where the earth had buckled and shoved itself toward the heavens. The air thinned, losing the suffocating weight of the valley heat and gaining a crisp, pine-scented bite that stung the lungs. Eli Thompson rode the bay gelding hard, pushing the animal up switchbacks that would have made a mountain goat hesitate. Ayanna rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her grip tightening as the drop-offs grew steeper. They had been riding for 4 days since the spring, moving like ghosts through a landscape that seemed determined to kill them. By the time they crested the final ridge, the sun was sinking behind the peaks, casting long, jagged shadows across a high, rocky plateau. It was a place of stark beauty, a table of granite dotted with ponderosa pines and wind-twisted junipers. To the south, the world fell away into a haze of purple canyons. To the north, the deep forests of the Apache stronghold waited in silence. Eli pulled the horse up, letting the animal blow. He scanned the tree line, his eyes narrowed against the glare. He felt a momentary loosening in his chest, the first true breath he had taken since the hanging tree. They had made it. They were miles beyond the patrol routes of the cavalry, deep in the territory where white men feared to tread. "We are here," Eli said, his voice rasping with fatigue. "The high ground." He swung his leg over the saddle horn and slid to the ground, his boots crunching on the pine needles. He reached up and helped Ayanna down. She looked different up here. The elevation seemed to suit her. The dust of the lowlands was gone, replaced by a flush in her cheeks. She stood straighter, her eyes scanning the forest not with fear, but with recognition. "You brought me home," she said softly. "I did," Eli replied. He reached for his canteen, intending to celebrate with a drink of tepid water. The click of a hammer being pulled back on a rifle was the only warning he got. It was a sound distinct from the wind in the pines or the call of a jay. It was mechanical, cold, and final. Eli froze, his hand hovering inches from the Colt on his hip. He did not draw. He knew that sound well enough to know that by the time his fingers touched the walnut grip, he would already be dead. "Don't!" a voice said from the trees. It was not Ayanna. It was a man's voice, deep and guttural, speaking broken English. Eli slowly raised his hands, spreading his fingers to show they were empty. He turned in a slow circle. They materialized from the forest like spirits taking form. One moment there was only shadow and bark. The next, there were 12 men standing in a loose circle around them. They were Apache scouts, their faces painted with stripes of black and white clay. They wore high moccasins and breechclouts, their chests bare and lean, mapped with the scars of a lifetime of war. They held Springfield rifles, likely stolen from dead soldiers, and they held them with the ease of men who slept with their weapons. Eli looked at the man closest to him, a warrior with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. The man's eyes were hard, devoid of mercy. Eli felt the cold certainty of death settle over him. He had ridden straight into the lion's den, just as he had warned Ayanna he would. He looked at Ayanna, expecting to see terror. He wanted to tell her to run, to hide behind the horse, but the words died in his throat. Ayanna was not afraid. She was not cowering. She stepped forward, moving away from Eli, placing herself between him and the lead warrior. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her posture shifting from that of a refugee to something regal. She spoke, and it was not the broken, halted English she had used with him. It was a torrent of fluid, sharp syllables, the language of the mountains. Her voice rang out clear and commanding, echoing off the granite walls. Eli watched, stunned, as the dynamic of the clearing shifted. The rifles did not lower, but the tension changed. The warriors looked at her, their expressions shifting from hostility to recognition, and then to something approaching awe. The lead warrior lowered his rifle slightly. He spoke back to her, his tone questioning, respectful. Ayanna answered him, gesturing to the sky, to the south, and finally, to Eli. She turned to Eli. Her face was unreadable, a mask of stone that he did not recognize. "Give them the gun." "Eli," she said in English. Eli looked at her. "Ayanna, give it to them, or they will kill you where you stand." Eli hesitated. To give up his weapon was to give up his life. But as he looked at the ring of painted faces, he knew he had no choice. He slowly unbuckled his gun belt, letting the heavy leather drop to the ground. He pulled the Winchester from the scabbard on the saddle and laid it beside the pistol. The warriors moved in. Hands grabbed his arms, rough and strong. They bound his wrists behind his back with rawhide thongs, tying them tight enough to cut off circulation. They took his horse. They took his knife. Ayanna did not stop them. She did not look at him. She walked past him, moving toward the lead warrior, who bowed his head to her. She placed a hand on the warrior's shoulder, whispering something, and then turned to lead the procession into the trees. Eli was shoved forward, stumbling over roots. He watched the back of the girl he had saved, the girl who had slept under his blanket and kissed him by the fire. She walked like a queen returning from exile, and Eli realized with a sickening jolt that he had not saved a helpless victim. He had delivered a package. They marched for an hour as twilight bled into night. The camp was hidden in a deep box canyon, invisible until one was standing directly inside it. It was a temporary settlement, wickiups made of brush and canvas scattered among the boulders. Fires burned low, casting long, dancing shadows against the canyon walls. As they entered the camp, the silence was heavy. This was not a war party celebrating a victory. It was a place of mourning and survival. Eli saw old women grinding corn with stones, their movements slow and brittle. He saw dogs that were little more than skeletons with fur, but it was the children that stopped his heart. They watched the procession with huge, hollow eyes. Their ribs were visible beneath their skin, their bellies distended from hunger. There were wounded men lying on blankets, bandages gray and bloody. The smell of the camp was not just wood smoke, it was the smell of sickness, of unwashed bodies, of a people being hunted to extinction. Ayanna separated from the group. An old woman, her face a map of wrinkles, emerged from the largest wickiup. She wore a deerskin dress adorned with beads and shells. When she saw Ayanna, she let out a cry that was half sob, half prayer. They embraced, the old woman weeping and clutching Ayanna's face. Eli was dragged to the center of the camp and forced to his knees. The warriors stood guard, their expressions unyielding. Ayanna spoke to the old woman, her mother, Eli realized, and then turned to address the gathering crowd. The tribe circled around, a sea of dark eyes fixing on the white man bound in the dirt. She spoke at length. Eli caught only the tone. She was telling a story. She pointed to the south, miming the rope, the hanging tree. She pointed to Eli. The tribe's reaction was divided. Some of the younger men, their faces twisted with grief and anger, shouted and gestured toward Eli with knives. They saw only a white invader, a symbol of the race that was starving them. But the elders listened quietly, their faces grave. They looked at Eli not with hate, but with a heavy, calculating curiosity. Ayanna finished speaking. She did not look at Eli. She turned and disappeared into the wickiup with her mother. Eli was hauled to his feet and dragged toward a small cave at the rear of the canyon, a natural hollow used for storage or prisoners. He was thrown inside. A guard was posted at the entrance, sitting cross-legged with a rifle across his knees. Hours passed. The cold of the high desert night seeped into the stone. Eli sat in the darkness, his hands numb, his mind reeling. He replayed every moment of the journey. Her silence, her strange questions, the necklace with the symbols, the mark of the ghost walker. A test. He felt a fool. He felt a fool for trusting, for feeling, for believing that he was the hero of the story. Sometime after midnight, the guard moved. A shadow slipped into the cave. Eli did not look up. He knew who it was. Ayanna stood over him. She held a clay bowl of water and a piece of cornbread. She set them down on the stone floor. "Eat," she said. Eli stared at the wall. "I'm not hungry. You must keep your strength," she said. "The council is debating. Some want to kill you at dawn. Others say you are the sign we have waited for." "A sign?" Eli laughed. A bitter, sharp sound. "Is that what I am? A sign? I thought I was the man who cut the rope." Ayanna sat down opposite him. She was wearing clean buckskins now, and her hair was braided with feathers. She looked beautiful and utterly alien. "You are both," she said. Eli turned his head, his eyes blazing in the dim light. "Who are you, Ayanna? Truly, I told you," she said calmly. "I am the daughter of the seeress. My mother dreamed of a white man who would come not to take, but to give, a man who would risk his life for an enemy." "So you staged it?" Eli asked, his voice rising. "The hanging? The traitor?" "No," she said sharply. "The hanging was real. The traitor was real. The hatred was real. But I let myself be taken. I went to the town knowing what might happen. I had to see what? See if there was any honor left in your people," she whispered. "We are dying, Eli. The soldiers burn our crops. They kill the buffalo. They poison the water. My brothers want to fight until the last drop of blood is spilled. My mother, she wanted to know if peace was even possible, if there was a single white man who saw us as human. So I was a test subject." Eli spat. "You dragged me across the desert. Let me bleed for you. Let me care for you. All to see if the lab rat would run the maze correctly. We needed a man who could choose right, even if he didn't know why," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "If you had known who I was, you might have saved me for a reward, or for politics. But you saved me because you could not watch me die. That is the only truth that matters. It matters to me," Eli shouted, struggling against his bonds. "It matters that I looked at you and saw someone who needed me. It matters that I opened up my own dark past to you, thinking we were sharing the load, but you were just taking notes." "I was not just taking notes," she said softly. Eli slumped back against the cold stone. He looked past her, out toward the sliver of moonlight visible at the cave mouth. He thought of the children he had seen, the skeletons with swollen bellies. He thought of the hopelessness that hung over this canyon like a shroud. He had a money belt strapped under his shirt. It held $300 in gold coin, his life savings. It was money meant for a small patch of land in Oregon. a place where he could finally stop running. It was his future. He looked at Ayanna. He hated the deception. He hated the politics. But he could not hate the desperation that drove them. "Untie me," Eli said quietly. Ayanna hesitated. "I am not going to run." He said, "I have something for your counsel." She moved forward, pulling a knife from her belt. She sliced the rawhide. Eli rubbed his wrists, the blood rushing back in painful tingles. He reached under his shirt and unbuckled the heavy canvas belt. The gold coins clinked together, a heavy, dull sound. He tossed the belt at her feet. It landed with a thud. "There is $300 in gold there," Eli said. "It's everything I have in the world. It won't buy you your land back, but it will buy blankets. It will buy flour and beef from the traders in Mexico who don't ask questions. It will get those children through the winter." Ayanna stared at the belt. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Why?" she asked. "After everything I just told you. After I used you." Eli leaned his head back against the rock and closed his eyes. "Because I saw the ribs on those kids, Ayanna, and because, despite everything, I still remember the way you looked at the water when you drank from my canteen. I am not doing it for your prophecy. I am doing it because I am a human being." A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Ayanna did not pick up the belt. Instead, she moved closer to him. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, rough with stubble. "You are a good man, Eli Thompson," she whispered. "Better than we deserved." Eli opened his eyes. He looked at her, and he felt the anger warring with the ache in his chest. He grabbed her hand, his grip tight, desperate. "And was that all I was to you?" he asked, his voice cracking. "A good man, a tool for your mother's vision? Was any of it real? Ayanna, the canyon, the fire." Ayanna let out a ragged breath. She looked at him, and the mask of the tribal princess fell away. Beneath it was the girl who had held him in the night, the girl who was terrified and lonely and carrying the weight of a dying world. "You were the only thing that was real," she said. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was frantic. It tasted of salt and desperation. Eli's resistance crumbled. He pulled her to him, his hands tangling in her hair, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He wanted to be angry, but the fear of death and the sheer, overwhelming relief of her touch washed it away. They clung to each other on the cold stone floor of the cave. It was a coupling born of the precipice, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of the void. There was no tenderness, only a fierce, consuming need to be close, to merge, to forget for a few hours that they were on opposite sides of a war that neither of them could stop. Eli held her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He whispered her name into the darkness, a prayer and a curse. She held him with the strength of a drowning woman, her nails digging into his shoulders, her tears wetting his shirt. They fell asleep entangled, limbs heavy and intertwined, covered by the rough wool blanket she had brought. When Eli woke, the light was gray and cold. He reached out, his hand seeking the warmth of her skin. He found only rough stone. He sat up, his heart hammering. The cave was empty. The bowl of water was still there, untouched. The piece of cornbread sat beside it. The money belt was gone. Eli scrambled to the entrance of the cave. The guard was gone. The camp outside was stirring with a morning routine, smoke rising from the fires. He stood there, blinking in the harsh light, the smell of her still on his skin, the phantom weight of her body still in his arms. He was free. It seemed alive. But as he looked at the empty space where she had been, he felt a hollowness that no amount of gold could ever fill. She had taken his offer. She had taken his love. And she had left him to face the morning alone, the morning they cast him out. The sky was the color of wet slate. There was no ceremony, no gathering of the elders, and certainly no farewell from the woman who had held him in the darkness hours before. Eli Thompson stood by his horse, checking the cinch with hands that felt numb and clumsy. His gun belt had been returned to him, hanging heavy on his hip. But the chamber of his Colt was empty. The warriors had removed the ammunition, handing him back a useless weight of steel and wood. They had left him his rifle in the scabbard, also unloaded, and a small pouch containing exactly 6 bullets, enough to hunt for food on the ride back to civilization, or perhaps enough to end his own suffering if the desert took him. The lead scout, the one with the scar through his eyebrow, stood 10 feet away, arms crossed over his chest. He watched Eli with the impassive gaze of a hawk watching a field mouse scurry toward a hole. "Go," the scout said. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the stillness of the dawn. "You have bought the lives of children. For this, you breathe. But do not mistake this for friendship. White man." Eli swung into the saddle. The bay gelding shifted beneath him, eager to be moving. Eli looked toward the wickiups, his eyes searching the camp for a glimpse of her. He looked for the sway of her long black hair, the flash of her buckskin dress. He saw only the smoke rising from the breakfast fires and the backs of people who had already forgotten him. "Do not return," the scout added, stepping closer. "If you cross the shadow of the rim again, we will not take you prisoner. We will leave you for the buzzards." Eli looked down at the man. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask if she knew he was leaving, if the money he had left would truly help, if the night in the cave had meant anything at all. But he looked at the scout's hard eyes and knew that words were wasted here. He was an outsider, a temporary necessity that had been used and discarded. He turned the horse's head and spurred him into a trot, riding out of the canyon without looking back. But the silence of the camp followed him, a heavy, accusatory weight that settled between his shoulder blades. He rode for 3 days, pushing deep into the labyrinth of the mountain wilderness, drifting south but staying high in the timber. He was a man haunted. The anger burned in his gut, a slow, acidic fire. He felt like a fool. He had played the hero, the savior, and in the end, he had been nothing more than a wallet and a pawn. He had given them his life savings, the money that was supposed to buy him peace in Oregon, and in return, he had received a warning and a broken heart. He camped on the 3rd night in a dense thicket of aspen near a trickling stream. He built a small fire, roasting a rabbit he had managed to shoot with one of his precious bullets. As he ate the stringy meat, he found himself staring into the flames, remembering the way the firelight had danced on Ayanna's skin. He remembered the desperate strength of her hands pulling him close, the taste of salt on her lips. Was it a lie? He asked the fire. The fire popped and hissed, offering no answers. The next morning, the world exploded. Eli was saddling the bay, his mind miles away, when the crack of a rifle shot shattered the mountain silence. The bullet whizzed past his ear, so close he felt the wind of it, and slammed into the trunk of an aspen tree, sending a shower of bark into his face. Eli threw himself to the ground, rolling behind a fallen log just as a second shot tore up the earth where he had been standing. "Give it up! Thompson!" a voice roared from the ridge above. "We got you pinned." Eli pressed his cheek into the dirt, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached for his Winchester, dragging it into the cover of the log. He had 5 bullets left. He levered around into the chamber, his movements frantic but precise. "Who are you?" Eli shouted back, his voice cracking with the dust. "Does it matter?" the voice laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound. "Sheriff Miller put a $500 reward on your head. Said you murdered 2 innocent citizens in cold blood. That's a lot of money for a drifter." Eli cursed. Of course, Miller wasn't going to let the humiliation stand. He had spun a story, turned Eli into a cold-blooded killer to cover his own corruption. Now, every 2-bit bounty hunter and aspiring gunman in the territory would be looking for him. There were 3 of them. Eli could see their movement through the gaps in the brush, flashes of movement against the gray rock of the slope. They were spreading out, trying to flank him. He rested the barrel of the Winchester on the log. He took a breath, forcing his hands to steady. He waited until he saw the checkered shirt of the man who had shouted. The man stepped out from behind a boulder, confident in his superior position. Eli fired. The shot echoed like a cannon blast in the confined space of the ravine. The man in the checkered shirt spun around, clutching his shoulder, and fell back behind the rock. A scream of pain pierced the air. "One down," Eli muttered, working the lever, but the other two were moving fast. Bullets chewed into the rotting wood of the log, sending splinters flying. Eli scrambled backward, keeping low, trying to reach the cover of a dense pine grove 20 yards behind him. He made it 10 yards before luck ran out. He felt the impact before he heard the shot. It was like being kicked by a mule. The bullet caught him in the left side, just above the hip, punching through flesh and grazing the bone. The force of it knocked him sideways, spinning him into the dirt. The pain was blinding, a white-hot poker searing through his body. Eli gasped, the air leaving his lungs. He tried to push himself up, but his left leg wouldn't support him. He dragged himself using his elbows, sliding into the depression of a dry creek bed just as another volley of shots kicked up the dirt around his boots. "He's hit," one of the hunters yelled. "Move in! Finish him!" Eli lay on his back in the creek bed, staring up at the patches of blue sky through the canopy. He checked the rifle. 3 rounds left. He checked his side. His shirt was already soaked dark with blood, the red stain spreading aggressively. He pressed his hand against the wound, his fingers slick and warm. "This is it," he thought. "This is where the road ends. Bleeding out in a ditch for a crime I didn't commit, for a woman who didn't want me." He heard the crunch of boots on gravel. They were coming down the slope. Eli gritted his teeth against the pain. He propped himself up against the bank of the creek bed, leveling the rifle at the bend where they would appear. He would not go quietly. He would take at least one more of them with him. The footsteps grew louder. Eli tightened his finger on the trigger. Suddenly, a small shadow detached itself from the brush directly above the approaching men. It was a blur of motion, silent and swift. There was a distinct thwip sound, followed immediately by a gurgling cry. The footsteps stopped. Confusion erupted. "What the hell?" someone shouted. "Another thwip! Another cry!" Eli watched, bewildered, as the 2 remaining bounty hunters stumbled into view, not attacking, but fleeing. One of them had an arrow protruding from his thigh. They scrambled back up the slope, dragging their wounded comrade, firing blindly into the trees above them. They didn't care about the reward anymore. They had run afoul of something far more terrifying than a wounded cowboy. They had run into the ghosts of the mountain. Eli kept the rifle raised, his vision swimming. He waited for the hunters to return, but the sounds of their retreat faded into the distance, replaced by the heavy silence of the forest. He lowered the gun, his head falling back against the dirt. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him cold and shaking. The pain in his side was a dull, throbbing agony that pulsed with every beat of his heart. He closed his eyes, drifting toward the darkness that beckoned at the edge of his consciousness. Water. Something cool and wet touched his lips. Eli jerked awake, gasping. He tried to grab his gun, but his hand was too weak. "Easy," a voice said. Not a man's voice, a child's. Eli blinked, his eyes focusing. Kneeling beside him was a boy, no more than 12 years old. He had coarse black hair cut short and wore a simple loincloth and high moccasins. His chest was bare, brown and lean. In his hand, he held a small water skin. "Drink," the boy said. The word was thick, heavily accented, but clear. Eli drank. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the best thing he had ever tasted. He coughed, the movement sending spikes of pain through his side. Who are you?" Eli rasped. The boy did not answer. He set the water skin down and turned his attention to Eli's wound. He pulled a knife from his belt, a stone blade, sharp as glass, and cut away the blood-soaked fabric of Eli's shirt. Eli flinched, hissing through his teeth. The boy looked at the angry, torn flesh. He reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled out a handful of greenish paste that smelled of pine pitch and crushed herbs. Without warning, he pressed it directly into the wound. Eli screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound that tore from his throat. The pain was blinding. a searing fire that turned the world white. He thrashed, grabbing the boy's wrist. But the boy held firm, pressing the poultice deep until the bleeding slowed. "Still," the boy commanded. "You bleed too much." Eli fell back, panting, sweat pouring off his face. The fire in his side subsided to a dull, hot ache. The boy began to bind the wound with strips of clean cloth he had produced from his pouch. "Why?" Eli whispered, looking at the boy's serious face. "Why help me?" The boy finished the knot and sat back on his heels. He looked at Eli with eyes that were far too old for his face. "She sent me," the boy said. Eli froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "She, Ayanna," the boy said. "She knew the bad men followed. She knew you would not see them." She said, "Watch him. Keep him alive." Eli stared at the boy, his heart pounding harder than it had during the gunfight. She hadn't abandoned him. She hadn't cast him out and forgotten him. She had sent a guardian. She had defied the council, defied her own mother perhaps, to ensure he survived. She cares?" Eli asked, the hope in his voice painful to hear. The boy stood up, wiping his hands on his legs. "She cries in the night," he said simply. "She says you are a fool, but you are her fool." Eli let out a laugh that turned into a cough. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, hot and sudden. A fool, yes, he was that, but knowing she had been watching, that she had extended her protection even as he rode away in anger, changed everything. It dissolved the bitterness that had been poisoning him for days. "Where is she?" Eli asked. The boy pointed north, toward the highest peaks where the snow lingered year-round. "She waits." Eli struggled to sit up. He grabbed the boy's arm for support. "Help me up. You cannot ride," the boy said. "You will tear the hole." "I can ride," Eli gritted out, his face pale. "Help me find my horse." It took them an hour to catch the bay, which had wandered downstream to graze. It took another hour for Eli to drag himself into the saddle, a process that left him gray-faced and trembling. But once he was up, once he had the reins in his hands, a new strength filled him. It was not physical strength. His body was wrecked, but a strength of purpose. He was going back. The ride back to the edge of the Apache territory was a blur of pain and determination. The boy, whose name was Chayton, ran alongside the horse, moving with the effortless endurance of his people. He guided Eli not back to the main camp, but to a secluded ridge miles to the east, a place where the pine forest gave way to a sweeping view of the valley below. They arrived at sunset on the second day. Eli slid from the horse, his legs buckling. Chayton helped him to a bed of pine needles beneath a massive, lightning-struck tree. "Wait here," Chayton said. He vanished into the shadows of the forest as if he had never existed. Eli waited. The night came down cold and hard. He wrapped himself in his saddle blanket, shivering as the fever from his wound flirted with his senses. He watched the moon rise, a sliver of silver that illuminated the ghostly shapes of the trees. He dozed, drifting in and out of dreams where ropes turned into snakes and gold coins turned into stones. He woke to the touch of a hand on his forehead. It was not the boy. The hand was slender, calloused but gentle. Eli opened his eyes. Ayanna was kneeling beside him. The moonlight washed over her, turning her skin to silver and her hair to ink. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed, but she was there. "You are trying to die. Eli Thompson," she whispered. Her voice was thick with emotion. Eli reached up, covering her hand with his. His palm was rough against hers. "I tried to leave," he croaked. "I tried to do what I was told, but your shadow followed me." Ayanna let out a shuddering breath. She leaned down, resting her forehead against his chest. "I told Chayton to keep you safe. I did not tell him to bring you back. You are in danger here, if the council knows." "Let them come," Eli said. "I don't care anymore." He pushed himself up, wincing as the movement pulled at his side. He looked at her, searching her face in the dim light. "Why did you let me go like that?" he asked. "Without a word. Because if I had spoken, I would have begged you to stay," she admitted, lifting her head to look at him. "And if you stayed, you would die. My people, we are on a path of blood. Eli, the end is coming. I can feel it. I see the soldiers gathering in the south. I see the winter coming with no food. I wanted you to live. I wanted you to find your land in Oregon and forget you ever saw a girl under a hanging tree. I can't, Eli said. I can't forget. I rode away. Ayanna. I was angry. I hated you for a few miles. But then I realized that the only time I felt alive in 10 years was when I was with you. I don't want Oregon. I don't want safety. You are a foolish man, she said, a tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. Maybe, Eli said. He reached up and wiped the tear away with his thumb. But I am a man who knows what he wants. Come with me. Ayanna pulled back, shaking her head. I cannot. Why? Eli demanded gently. You said it yourself. The end is coming. Why stay for the slaughter? Come with me. We can go to Mexico. We can go north, to Canada. We can disappear. My mother is here. She said, the children are here. The bones of my father are here. If I leave, I am just another runaway. I am the daughter of the seeress. My place is to stand with them when the darkness falls. I cannot choose my own happiness over their survival. Eli looked at her, seeing the iron resolve beneath the sorrow. He understood duty. He understood loyalty. It was what had driven him to cut the rope in the first place, but it broke him to see it standing between them now like a canyon wall. So that's it? He asked softly. We just say goodbye. Ayanna did not answer. She leaned forward and kissed him. This kiss was different than the one in the cave. It was not frantic. It was slow, deep, and unutterably sad. It was a kiss of mourning. It tasted of the pine forest and the coming winter. She pushed him back gently against the bed of needles. She moved over him, mindful of his wound, her movements fluid and careful. Eli reached for her, pulling her down. They came together under the canopy of the ancient trees, two small, fragile sparks in a vast, indifferent wilderness. They moved together with a slowness that bordered on pain, memorizing the feel of skin, the rhythm of breath, the beat of hearts that were racing in unison. It was an act of defiance against the death that stalked them both. It was a claiming and a releasing all at once. Eli held her, feeling the scars on her thighs, the strength in her back, and he loved her with a ferocity that terrified him. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the cold air biting at their skin. Ayanna rested her head on his shoulder, her hands splayed over his heart. I have dreamed of you, she whispered into the darkness. Eli turned his head to look at her. When? Since I was a girl, she said, before the hanging, before the traitor. I had a dream of a man with eyes like the winter sky, a man who carried a heavy gun but had gentle hands. My mother said it was a spirit guide. I never thought he would be flesh and blood. Eli swallowed past the lump in his throat. He had spent his life mocking superstition, trusting only in lead and horseflesh. I never believed in fate, he said quietly. I thought life was just a series of random collisions, bad luck and good luck. But finding you, saving you, it doesn't feel random. Ayanna, it feels like I was walking a trail that led to you my whole life. Ayanna shifted, propping herself up on one elbow. She looked down at him. Her hair created a curtain around them, shutting out the rest of the world. Her eyes were fierce, burning with that same intensity he had seen in the cave. Then believe this, she said, her voice low and commanding. She took his hand and pressed it against her chest, over her own beating heart. I will be yours, Eli Thompson. Not in a dream, not in another life. In this one. She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. But only if you fight for me. Eli stared up at her, the words echoing in his mind. If you fight for me? It wasn't a request for him to fight the soldiers or the sheriff. It was a challenge to fight the inevitability of their separation, to fight the history that said they couldn't be together, to fight the death she was so resigned to. He reached up and cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her lip. I'm done running, he whispered. Tell me what to do. Ayanna smiled, a sad, secret smile. Heal, she said, heal, and wait. The moon is turning. When it is full, the leaders meet. There is a chance, a small chance, for peace. But there are wolves at the door. Eli, white wolves and Apache wolves. They want blood. I'll kill them all if I have to, Eli vowed. No, she said. Killing is easy. Making peace. That is the fight I need you for. She kissed him one last time, brief and hard, then pulled away. She stood up, gathering her buckskins, transforming back into the warrior daughter of the tribe. Stay here, she commanded. Chayton will bring you food. Do not come to the camp until I send for you. She turned to leave, melting back into the shadows of the trees. Ayanna! Eli called out, his voice weak but desperate. She stopped, looking back over her shoulder. I love you, he said. The words felt strange on his tongue, heavy and terrified. She looked at him for a long moment, her silhouette framed against the stars. Then fight, she whispered, and she was gone. Eli lay back on the pine needles, the pain in his side throbbing in time with his heart. He looked up at the vast, empty sky. He was wounded. He was hunted. And he was in love with a woman who was walking straight into a war. He closed his eyes and clenched his fists. He would heal. He would wait. And when the time came, he would fight the whole damn world if that's what it took to keep her. The silence of the high country was a balm, but it was also a lie. Eli Thompson lay beneath the shelter of the lightning-struck pine for 3 days, letting the resinous scent of the forest and the cold mountain air knit his flesh back together. Chayton came and went like a spirit, bringing strips of dried venison, fresh water, and fresh poultices for the bullet wound in Eli's side. The boy spoke little, his eyes always scanning the tree line, a sentinel caught between childhood and war. Eli healed, but the peace Ayanna had spoken of did not settle in his bones. Instead, a cold, hard resolve began to calcify in his chest. He replayed her words until they lost the softness of the moonlight and took on the weight of a command. If you fight for me. He realized then that he had been fighting the wrong battle. He had been fighting to survive, fighting to escape, fighting to hide. But hiding would not save Ayanna. Hiding would not stop the starvation in the canyon or the encroaching greed of men like Sheriff Miller. To save her, he could not just be a guardian in the shadows. He had to destroy the lie that threatened to consume her people. On the morning of the 4th day, Eli stood up, his side pulled tight, a dull ache that would likely be with him for the rest of his life. But his legs held. He saddled the bay gelding, his movements deliberate and slow. He checked his Colt. It was empty. He checked the Winchester. 3 rounds. He looked at Chayton, who was watching him from the perch of a granite boulder. Go back to her, Eli rasped, his voice rough from disuse. Tell her I'm done running. Tell her I'm going to the source. The boy tilted his head. You go to die, white man. I go to tell the truth, Eli said, tightening the cinch. Sometimes they are the same thing. He mounted the horse, wincing as his body settled into the leather, and turned the animal's head not south toward Mexico, but west, straight back into the teeth of the danger. He rode toward Sano's Creek. The journey down from the rim was a descent into hell. The heat returned, suffocating and heavy, and the air grew thick with the dust of the lowlands. Eli rode openly. He did not stick to the washes or the shadows. He rode the main wagon road, a solitary figure on a dust-caked horse, looking like a revenant returning from the grave to settle a debt. He reached Sano's Creek just past high noon. The town was sweltering, the buildings shimmering in the heat waves. It was a collection of false-fronted wooden structures and adobe hovels, a place built on copper dust and bad whiskey. As Eli rode down the main street, the town seemed to hold its breath. A woman sweeping a boardwalk stopped, her broom held mid-stroke. 2 miners emerging from the dry goods store froze, their eyes widening as they recognized the rider. The wanted posters were likely plastered on every wall, declaring him a mad dog killer, a butcher of innocence. Eli did not look at them. He kept his eyes fixed on the small, brick building at the end of the street, the sheriff's office. He pulled the bay up to the hitching rail in front of the jail. He did not tie the horse. He sat there for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the eyes of the town boring into his back. Then, slowly, He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the dust. His knees buckled slightly, but he forced himself upright. "Sheriff!" Eli bellowed. The sound tore through the oppressive quiet. "Sheriff Miller, get out here!" The door to the office opened with a groan of hinges. Sheriff Miller stepped out onto the boardwalk. He was a big man, thick around the middle, with a mustache that hid a mouth prone to cruelty. He wore a star on his vest and a shotgun in the crook of his arm. 2 deputies flanked him, their hands hovering near their holsters. Miller squinted against the sun, and then a slow, incredulous grin spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," Miller said, his voice carrying easily to the gathering crowd. "The prodigal murderer returns. You have a death wish. Thompson, or did you just run out of places to hide?" Eli stood in the middle of the street, his hands hanging loose at his sides, nowhere near his empty pistol. He looked at Miller, and then he turned slowly to face the town. A crowd was forming. Shopkeepers, ranch hands, barmaids, the very people who had been told that Eli was a monster. "I am here to set the record straight," Eli said, his voice booming. He pointed a shaking finger at Miller. "This man told you I killed innocent men. He told you I kidnapped a girl. He killed 2 of my deputies," Miller shouted, stepping off the boardwalk. "Cut him down! Hold on!" a voice cried out from the crowd. It was the blacksmith, a burly man with soot on his face. "Let him speak. He ain't drawn a weapon." Miller hesitated, sensing the shift in the air. He couldn't shoot an unarmed man in broad daylight with half the town watching. Not without raising questions he didn't want to answer. Eli seized the moment. He looked directly at the blacksmith, then swept his gaze over the crowd. "The girl was not a spy," Eli said, his voice steady despite the pain in his side. "She was a pawn. This man, your sheriff, bought her. He paid $50 to a one-eyed trader for an Apache girl, not to arrest her, but to hang her. He staged a lynching to provoke a war." "Lies!" Miller roared, his face turning a mottled red. "The man is deranged. He's been out in the sun too long. He wanted the Apaches to attack," Eli continued, shouting over him. He wanted the army to come in and clear the land so he and his partners could claim the water rights in the basin. "I didn't kill innocents. I killed 2 men who were strangling a girl for sport. I shot the rope, and they opened fire on me." The crowd murmured. The story had the ring of truth, or at least the ring of plausibility. Miller was feared, but he was not loved, and everyone knew his greed ran deep. "I have seen the tribe you are so afraid of," Eli said, lowering his voice so they had to lean in to hear. "They are starving. They are not planning a massacre. They are planning a funeral, and this man wants to turn their desperation into your profit." "Enough!" Miller screamed. He lunged forward, swinging the barrel of the shotgun like a club. Eli tried to dodge, but his injury slowed him. The heavy steel barrel caught him on the side of the head, just above the ear. The world exploded into white light and then darkness. Eli hit the dirt hard. He felt boots slamming into his ribs, reopening his wound, sending fresh agony screaming through his nerves. He curled into a ball, trying to protect his head. As the deputies joined in, "Get him inside," Miller was shouting, breathless with exertion. "Get this trash out of my sight." Eli was dragged through the dust, his heels carving furrows in the street. He was hauled up the steps and thrown into a cell at the back of the jailhouse. The door clanged shut with the finality of a coffin lid. He lay on the cold stone floor, tasting copper and dirt. His head swam, and darkness threatened to pull him under again. He heard Miller in the outer office, yelling at the crowd to disperse, threatening to arrest anyone who listened to the rambling of a cop killer. Eli closed his eyes. He had fought. He had told the truth, and now, it seemed, he was going to die for it. Hours passed. The heat of the day bled away, replaced by the stifling, stagnant air of the jail. Eli pulled himself up onto the narrow cot, his body a landscape of bruises and pain. His side was bleeding again, soaking through the bandage Chayton had applied. Night fell, thick and heavy. The town quieted down, though an undercurrent of tension remained. Eli could hear voices drifting in from the street, angry, hushed arguments. His words had planted a seed. Sometime after midnight, the heavy oak door to the cell block creaked open. Eli stiffened, expecting Miller and a length of rope. He braced himself for the end. But the figure that slipped into the corridor was not the sheriff. It was a woman. She wore a heavy woolen shawl wrapped around her head and shoulders. Obscuring her face, she moved silently, hugging the shadows. She stopped at the bars of his cell. "Eli?" she whispered. The voice hit him harder than the shotgun barrel. He dragged himself off the cot and stumbled to the bars, gripping the cold iron to hold himself up. "Ayanna?" She lowered the shawl. Her face was streaked with dust, her eyes wide and terrified, but burning with that fierce intelligence he loved. She looked at his battered face, the blood matted in his hair, and a small, choked sound escaped her throat. "You came back," she whispered, reaching through the bars to touch his bruised cheek. "You foolish, foolish man." "I had to," Eli rasped, leaning into her touch. "I couldn't let the lie stand." She pulled a small flask of water and a clean rag from beneath her shawl. Working quickly, she began to wipe the dried blood from his face. Her touch was tender, efficient, the touch of a healer. "Miller is planning to hang you at dawn," she said softly. "He says it is for the murders, but it is because you spoke the truth. The town is divided. Some believe you, most are just afraid. Let them hang me," Eli said. "If it stops the war—" "No," Ayanna said sharply. She pressed the wet cloth against a cut on his lip. "If you die, there is no hope. The tribal elders have agreed to meet. My mother convinced them. They will come to the old cottonwood grove at sunrise to negotiate, but they will only speak to the white settlers if you are there." "Me?" Eli asked. "Why me?" "Because you are the bridge." "Eli, you are the only white man who has bled for us. If Miller kills you, the tribe will see it as a declaration of total war. They will attack the town, and then everyone dies." She dropped the rag and gripped the bars with both hands, pulling herself as close as the iron would allow. "You must live. Eli, the peace depends on your breath." Eli looked at her. Seeing the desperate hope in her eyes, he felt a surge of helplessness. He was locked in a cage, battered and unarmed, while the fate of two peoples rested on his survival. "I don't know how to get out of here. Ayanna," he admitted, "Miller has the keys. We will find a way," she vowed. She leaned her forehead against the bars, her face inches from his. Eli closed the distance. He kissed her, tasting the iron of the bars and the salt of her skin and the metallic tang of his own blood. It was a kiss of desperation, a promise made in the shadow of the gallows. "I have to go," she whispered against his lips. "I have to meet with the blacksmith and the others who believed you. We have to organize the meeting." "Be careful," Eli said, gripping her hand through the bars. "Miller isn't alone. I am always careful." She pulled away, wrapping the shawl back around her head. She looked at him one last time, a silhouette of grace in the grim darkness of the jail. "Fight, Eli," she whispered. Then she was gone, slipping out into the night as silently as she had come. Eli sank back onto the cot. He felt a renewed fire in his gut. He wasn't just fighting for her anymore. He was fighting for the future she was trying to build. Meanwhile, in the back room of the Golden Steer Saloon, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of violence. Sheriff Miller sat at a poker table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. Around him sat 6 men, hard men, drifters and hired guns he had deputized off the books. He stirred up a hornet's nest. Miller growled, pouring a shot. "That blacksmith and his friends are talking about a trial. They're talking about waiting for a federal judge. We can't have a trial." "Sheriff," one of the men said, a scar-faced bounty hunter cleaning his fingernails with a knife. "If he testifies—" "He won't testify," Miller said, slamming the glass down. "And neither will those savages." Miller leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malice. "The girl is back. One of my boys saw a shadow moving near the livery. If she's here, the rest of them are close. They're planning something. Maybe a rescue, maybe a parley. So what do? We don't wait for dawn," Miller said. "We don't wait for a hanging. We finish this tonight. We ride out to their village while they're thinking about peace talks. We burn it to the ground. We kill the leaders. We kill the girl. And when we come back, we tell the town that Thompson's friends attacked us, and we had to defend ourselves. We hang Thompson in the morning as a co-conspirator." The men around the table grinned. It was a brutal, simple plan. It wiped the slate clean. "Get your horses," Miller commanded. "We ride in 20 minutes. Back in the jail." Eli paced the small cell. The pain in his side was a rhythmic throb, but he ignored it. He tested the bars. Solid iron, set deep in the rock. He checked the window. Too high, too small. He heard a commotion outside, horses whinnying, men shouting orders, the heavy thud of boots on the boardwalk. Then, silence. A key turned in the lock of the outer door. Eli tensed. Had Miller decided to move up the execution? The door to the cell block opened. A man stepped into the lantern light. He was older, with a shock of white hair, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a leather rancher's coat and carried a heavy ring of keys. It was Silas Cobb. Eli blinked, unsure if he was hallucinating. "Silas?" Silas Cobb stopped in front of the cell. He looked Eli up and down, shaking his head with a mixture of disgust and affection. "You look like pounded steak, son," Silas drawled. Eli gripped the bars. "Silas, what are you doing here? Where's the deputy?" "Sleeping peacefully behind his desk with a lump on his head the size of a goose egg," Silas said calmly. He began sorting through the keys. "Why?" Eli asked. "You and I haven't spoken in 5 years." "Not since I left the outfit." Silas found the right key and slid it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a heavy clack. "I heard you in the street today," Silas said, swinging the door open. "You always were a stubborn fool." "Eli, but you never were a liar. And I never did like Miller. Man cheats at cards." He stepped back, gesturing for Eli to exit. "Besides," Silas added, his voice dropping, "I saw Miller and his boys riding out. They weren't heading for the bordello. They were loaded for bear. Heading north." "North?" Eli felt the blood drain from his face. "Toward the village?" Silas nodded. "Reckon they plan to make sure there ain't no one left to negotiate with in the morning." "Ayanna, the meeting, it was a setup. Miller was going to slaughter them while they slept, while they waited for a peace that was never coming." Eli stumbled out of the cell. He grabbed Silas by the shoulders. "I have to stop them. They're going to burn the village." "I figured," Silas said. "That's why I brought your iron." He reached under his coat and pulled out Eli's gun belt. He had somehow retrieved it from the sheriff's office. He handed it to Eli, along with a box of ammunition. "And I brought your horse around back," Silas said. "He's fed and watered." Eli strapped the belt on, his hands shaking as he thumbed cartridges into the cylinder of the Colt. The weight of the gun felt good. It felt like justice. "You coming with me?" Eli asked, looking at the old rancher. Silas pulled a lever-action rifle from his own shoulder. "I'm too old to be breaking folks out of jail just to watch them die alone in the dark. Let's ride." They burst out the back door of the jail into the cool night air. Red was there, saddled and waiting, alongside a roan mare. Eli swung into the saddle, the pain in his side flaring and then vanishing under a surge of adrenaline. They turned the horses toward the north, toward the dark silhouette of the mountains. "We have to beat them there," Eli shouted over the wind. They spurred their mounts, galloping out of Sanos Creek, leaving the sleeping town behind. Ahead of them, the road stretched out into the darkness, a ribbon of dust leading straight to a massacre. Eli leaned low over Red's neck, whispering to the horse, urging him faster. He thought of Ayanna waiting in the cottonwood grove. He thought of the children in the wickiups. He thought of the peace she had dreamed of. Miller had a head start, but he was riding with hate. Eli was riding with something stronger. He was riding for love, and he would burn the whole world down before he let them touch her. The smell of burning pine reached them long before the sound of gunfire. It was a heavy, acrid scent that coated the back of the throat, a harbinger of destruction that rode the night wind down from the foothills. Eli Thompson and Silas Cobb spurred their horses, driving the animals through the scrub brush and dry washes. ignoring the treacherous footing in the darkness. They crested the final rise, overlooking the cottonwood grove where the peace talks were meant to be taking place. The scene below was a vision of hell. Sheriff Miller had not waited for a parley. He had not waited for dawn. He had launched an ambush of overwhelming brutality. The grove, usually a place of sanctuary near the water, was illuminated by the erratic, terrified orange glow of burning wagons and brush fires. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp, cracking reports of repeating rifles. "They are slaughtering them," Silas shouted over the roar of the wind and fire. Miller's men had surrounded the clearing. They were firing indiscriminately into the center, where a cluster of tribal elders and a handful of white settlers, the brave few who had dared to hope for peace, were pinned down behind overturned wagons and rocks. Eli did not think. He did not formulate a strategy. He simply reacted, driven by a terrifying clarity. He drew his Colt, the weight of it familiar and lethal in his hand, and kicked Red into a gallop down the slope. "Let's even the odds," Eli roared. He and Silas hit the flank of Miller's line like a thunderbolt. The deputies and hired guns, focused on the slaughter in the center, did not expect an attack from the rear. Eli fired as he rode, the muzzle flashes of his pistol blooming in the dark. One of Miller's men, a deputy Eli recognized from the beating in the street, spun around and collapsed, clutching his leg. Silas pulled up his roan mare and leveled his lever-action rifle, firing with the calm precision of a man who had hunted wolves all his life. Two more of the attackers scrambled for cover, their formation breaking under the sudden pressure. Eli drove his horse through the gap in the line, leaping over a burning log and skidding into the center of the defensive circle. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, landing in the dirt beside an overturned buckboard wagon. Inside the circle, chaos reigned. Apache warriors, armed mostly with bows and old trade muskets, were returning fire, trying to shield the women and the few white settlers who were huddled in the dirt. Eli scanned the faces, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked for her. "Ayanna!" he screamed, his voice raw. He saw movement near the creek bank. A figure was moving not away from the fire, but toward it. It was Ayanna. She was not hiding. She had recovered a rifle from a fallen warrior and was kneeling behind a boulder. Firing back at the shadows in the trees, she moved with a terrifying grace, working the lever of the gun, her face set in a mask of concentration. Eli ran to her, keeping low as bullets chewed up the ground around his boots. He slid in beside her, his shoulders slamming against hers. She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, her mask cracked. A fierce, wild joy lit her eyes. "You are late," she shouted over the din of the battle. "I had to break out of jail," Eli shouted back, reloading his pistol with shaking hands. They turned together, facing the dark tree line. It was a rhythm they had found in the high mountains, a silent communication of breath and movement. They fought side by side, not as rescuer and victim, but as soldiers holding the line against the dark. Eli fired, taking down a man who tried to rush their position. Ayanna fired, her shot clipping a sniper in the branches of an oak tree. The battle was turning. The surprise arrival of Eli and Silas had bought the defenders time. The Apache warriors, seeing the white man fighting for them, rallied with a renewed ferocity. They began to push out from the center, their war cries rising above the sound of the guns. But Miller was not done. From the smoke to the east, the sheriff emerged, riding a massive black stallion. He was shouting orders, trying to rally his men for one final, crushing charge. He wasn't interested in victory anymore. He wanted extermination. "Burn it all!" Miller screamed. "Leave nothing moving." His men unleashed a volley of fire. Bullets tore through the wood of the wagons and chipped shards of granite from the boulders near the center of the camp. A settler woman, the wife of the blacksmith, was trying to drag her young daughter to better cover. The girl, no more than 10 years old, was frozen in terror, staring at the charging horses. "Watch out!" Eli yelled, raising his gun. But he was too far away. One of Miller's hired trackers, a renegade who used a short, powerful bow, broke from the smoke. He wasn't aiming for the warriors. He raised his bow, targeting the settler's child, aiming to kill the innocent to ensure that hate would separate the two peoples forever. The string twanged. "No!" Ayanna screamed. She did not fire. She did not shout a warning. She moved. She broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground between the boulder and the wagon. She threw herself in front of the girl just as the arrow hissed through the air. The sound of the impact was a dull, wet thud that Eli felt in his own chest. Ayanna gasped. Her momentum arrested violently. She stumbled back, the shaft of the arrow protruding from her left shoulder, high near the collarbone. She fell to her knees, but she did not cry out. She looked down at the child she had shielded, her eyes wide with shock. "Ayanna!" Eli roared. The sight of her falling broke something inside him. The calm, calculated shooter vanished. In his place was a man possessed by a pure, white-hot rage. He stood up, abandoning cover. He walked straight toward the renegade archer, firing his Colt until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. The renegade fell. Eli didn't stop. He threw the empty gun aside and drew the knife from his belt. Miller saw him. The sheriff raised his shotgun, aiming at Eli's exposed back, but Miller never pulled the trigger. A shot rang out from the ridge, a long, echoing crack of a buffalo rifle. Miller was lifted from his saddle as if by a giant hand, thrown backward into the dirt. High on the ridge, Silas Cobb lowered his smoking rifle. With their leader dead, the remaining attackers broke. The will to fight evaporated, replaced by the primal urge to survive. They turned their horses and fled into the night, disappearing into the smoke and the dark. The silence that followed was sudden and deafening. Eli reached Ayanna. He dropped to his knees in the dust, his hands hovering over her, terrified to touch her, terrified to cause her more pain. She was pale, her skin taking on the gray cast of ash. The arrow had gone deep. Blood was soaking the front of her buckskin dress, dark and slick. "Ayanna," Eli whispered, his voice trembling. "Look at me. Stay with me." She blinked, her eyes losing focus. "Eli." "We have to get her help," the blacksmith's wife sobbed, clutching her daughter. "She saved my Mary. She saved her." Eli scooped Ayanna up into his arms. She felt lighter than air, fragile as a bird. He ignored the pain in his own side, ignored the exhaustion that pulled at his limbs. "Get the medicine, woman," Eli shouted to the warriors gathering around. He carried her away from the smoke, up the slope toward the cleaner air of the hills. He laid her down on a bed of soft grass beneath the stars. He pressed his hands against the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood. "Ayanna, listen to me," Eli begged, leaning close to her face. "Do not go where I cannot follow. Do not leave me here." Her eyes fluttered open. She looked up at him, struggling to focus. "You fought," she whispered, a faint smile touching her lips. "I fought," Eli choked out, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "I fought for you. She saved the white child," an Apache elder said, standing over them. He looked at the blacksmith's wife, who was kneeling nearby, weeping with gratitude. Eli looked down at Ayanna. Her breathing was shallow, rattling in her chest. "Why?" Eli asked, brushing the hair from her damp forehead. "Why did you do that?" "Because," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "Hate stops here." She gripped his hand, her fingers weak. "You thought I was a trap," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "No," Eli said fiercely, gripping her hand tight. "Never. You were never a trap. Ayanna, you were my salvation. You saved me from a life without meaning." "You hear me? You are the only thing that makes sense." She did not answer. Her hand went slack in his grip. "No!" Eli shouted. He pulled her up against his chest, rocking her, begging the spirits of the mountain, the god of the settlers, anyone who would listen, to spare her. The medicine woman arrived, pushing Eli gently aside. She worked quickly, breaking the arrow shaft, packing the wound with pungent herbs, chanting a low, rhythmic song that mingled with the sobs of the blacksmith's wife. Eli sat back on his heels, watching. His whole world narrowed down to the rise and fall of her chest. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in soft hues of rose and gold. The fire in the grove had burned itself out, leaving behind charred wood and the bodies of the dead. But in the light of the new day, something miraculous had taken root. The attackers were gone. Sheriff Miller was dead, and in the center of the valley, Apache warriors and white settlers were working together. They were tending to the wounded. They were sharing water. The image of the Apache princess taking an arrow for the settler's daughter had shattered the narrative of hate that Miller had carefully constructed. The blacksmith approached the elders, his hat in his hand. He spoke of a truce. He spoke of sharing the water rights. He spoke of justice for Miller's crimes. It was a fragile peace, born of blood and trauma, but it was real. Eli did not care about the politics. He sat by the small fire where Ayanna lay, watching her face. Around mid-morning, her eyelids fluttered. She took a deep breath, wincing in pain, and opened her eyes. They were clear. "Eli?" she rasped. "I am here," Eli said, leaning over her, his heart restarting in his chest. "I am right here." She looked around, seeing the settlers and the warriors talking, seeing the calm of the camp. "Did we win?" she asked. Eli smiled, a broken, exhausted expression of pure relief. "Yeah, darlin'," he said, "we won." Ayanna survived. The recovery was long and hard. For weeks, fever racked her body, and the wound threatened to take her spirit even as her flesh knit together. Eli did not leave her side. He slept on the ground beside her wickiup. He fed her broth. He changed her bandages. The tribe watched him. They saw a white man who did not seek gold or land, but only the life of one of their own. The hostility that had greeted him on the plateau melted away, replaced by a quiet respect. The elders began to call him Nantan Lupan, Grey Wolf, for the way he sat guard by her door. When Ayanna was finally strong enough to stand, to walk to the edge of the canyon and look out over the land, the world had changed. The sheriff's death had brought a federal investigation, and a new honest magistrate had been appointed in Sanos Creek. The treaties were being renegotiated, with the blacksmith and Silas Cobb speaking on behalf of the tribe. Eli stood beside her on the rim of the canyon. He looked out at the town in the distance. "You could go back," Ayanna said quietly. "You are a hero there now. They would give you a badge. You could have your ranch in Oregon." Eli looked at the town. Then he looked at the vast, rugged expanse of the Apache high country. He looked at the woman standing beside him, the scar on her shoulder a match for the one on his side. "I sold the ranch," Eli said. "Silas bought the cattle." Ayanna looked at him, surprised. "Then where will you go?" "I was thinking," Eli said, looking at the ground and kicking a stone with his boot. "There is a cabin, old trapper shack, up near the timberline. It's on the edge, not in the town, not quite in the village. It's a bridge place, Ayanna repeated. Eli turned to her. "I'm done with towns, Ayanna, and I can't be Apache, but I can be the man who lives between, the man who keeps the peace, if you'll have me." Ayanna smiled, and it was the smile that had saved him in the cave, the smile that had brought him back from the dead. "I told you, Eli Thompson," she said, stepping close to him. "I will be yours." She rested her head against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her. Finally, truly home. 6 years later, the high plains were a sea of wildflowers, a riot of yellow and purple swaying in the summer breeze. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and rain. A child, a boy of 5 with wild black hair and eyes the color of faded denim, ran through the tall grass. He was laughing, chasing a butterfly, his legs pumping with endless energy. He wore a mixture of buckskin and denim, a child of 2 worlds, belonging fully to both. Eli Thompson stood on the ridge, watching the boy run. Eli was 41 now, and the gray in his beard had spread, but the lines of tension around his eyes were gone. He wore a simple cotton shirt and moccasins, his gun belt hanging on a peg inside the cabin behind him. He felt a hand on his back. Ayanna stood beside him. She was more beautiful now than the day he had found her. Motherhood and peace had softened the edges of her survival. Though the steel remained in her spine, she watched their son, a look of fierce pride on her face. "He runs like a deer," she said, He runs like his mother, Eli corrected, putting his arm around her waist. If he ran like me, he'd be tripping over his own feet. Ayanna leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. They stood there in silence, watching the fruit of their struggle play in the safety they had carved out of a hostile world. The boy shouted something in Apache, then switched to English, calling out to a hawk circling overhead. Ayanna looked up at Eli. Her eyes were playful, but beneath the humor was the memory of the fire and the rope. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes I wonder—" "Wonder what?" Eli asked, kissing the top of her head. "If you ever regret it, falling into my trap." Eli laughed. It was a deep, rich sound that echoed off the canyon walls. He turned her in his arms, looking down into the face that had haunted his dreams and saved his soul. He thought of the loneliness of the trail. He thought of the guilt that used to choke him. And then he looked at the boy running in the flowers, and the woman holding him with hands that had once been bound for execution. He smiled, brushed a strand of hair from her temple, and kissed her there, right over the pulse. "Darlin'," he whispered, "if this is a trap, I'll never leave it. Thank you so much for riding along on this journey with Eli and Ayanna. Writing this story has been a vivid experience, walking through the dust and the pines of a time when love was often the only shield against a brutal world. I hope their story resonated with you. I would love to hear where you're listening from today. Please leave a comment below and let me know which part of the story touched you the most. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story and want to hear more tales from the frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. Your support helps keep these campfires burning. Please share your thoughts in English in the comments section. I read every single one. Until the next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.